They called her the ugliest Omega in every pack, and wolves had traveled 3 days from the Northern Territories just to watch the proud Alpha of Silvermoon disgrace himself by marrying her. None of them knew that before the moon reached its highest point, the Alpha groom would be kneeling before his bride, staring at scars carved there by her own father. The Oldridge Temple had never held so many guests, and it had never held so much cruelty. Every bench beneath the vaulted stone ceiling was crowded with pack nobility. Silver pins, fur-lined cloaks, jeweled collars marking bloodlines going back 100 generations, and not a single one of them had come to bless the union. They had come to watch. Word had traveled faster than a howl through the territories. Alpha Matthew Darwin, last hope of a starving pack, was marrying the girl they called the Gathrum Curse. Hannah stood at the rear of the temple beneath an arch carved with the phases of the moon, and she made herself breathe evenly, the way Mira had taught her. In through the nose. Hold. Let it go slow enough that no one in the room could see her shaking. She was 24, tall enough that most alphas here had to tilt their chin to meet her eyes. Built solid, rather than slight. An Omega who had never once folded herself smaller to be forgiven for the space she took up. The crimson birthmark spread from her left temple down across her cheek and into the curve of her throat, raised and dark where the candlelight caught it, and beneath it, small clustered scars marked skin no one in this room would ever ask about. She wore no veil. Lace made the marks burn, and besides, she had decided, somewhere between yesterday and this morning, that she was finished pretending there was something under here worth hiding. She had heard every name they had for her, the Gathrum Curse, her father's failure, the Omega whose own wolf refused to claim her, silent, and sleeping inside her for 24 years like it too, was ashamed of what it would have to wear. She had stopped flinching at most of those names a long time ago. She had not stopped flinching at her father. At the front of the temple, beneath the great moon arch, stood the man half the room had come to pity rather than envy. Alpha Matthew Darwin, 29, broad through the shoulders in dark ceremonial gray, his jaw set in the particular stillness of a man who had made his decision before the doubt could catch up to him. Silvermoon's harvests had burned twice this year. His people were surviving on bark bread and calling it enough. He had signed his name to this marriage the way a man signs for a debt he intends to survive, not the way a man signs for love. And still, when Hannah came into view at the far end of the aisle, he did not flinch, and he did not look away. He did not perform a smile for the crowd. He did not glance aside, embarrassed on her behalf, the way 3 other alphas had done in the private meetings that came before this one. He simply watched her walk toward him, the way a sailor watches a storm he has already decided to stand inside. The whispers followed her up the aisle like smoke rolling off wet wood. He must be getting half the Gathrum treasury for this. Not even moonlight is kind to that face. Someone laughed behind a lace fan, quiet and sharp as a knife drawn across silk. Matthew heard it. She watched something pull tight at the corner of his jaw, and still his expression did not change, and still his eyes did not leave hers. When she reached the front, he stepped forward before the elder had even lifted a hand to call them together, and offered her his arm in front of the entire temple. It was such a small thing. A courtesy any groom might owe any bride on any ordinary wedding day. It was the first act of loyalty anyone had ever given her in front of a crowd that wanted her to fail, and neither of them yet understood what it would cost him, or what it would end up saving. Hannah studied his face, while the elder began the binding words, searching for the thing she always searched for now, in anyone who looked at her too long, the flicker of disgust hiding politely behind good manners. She had gotten very good at finding it. She had never once been wrong. She could not find it in him. Not in his eyes, not in the set of his mouth, not in the hand steady beneath hers. It unsettled her more than contempt would have. Near the front row, her father rose to his feet. Alpha King Magnus Gather moved through the temple like a man accepting applause he hadn't earned. Tall, silver at the temples, radiating the kind of practiced warmth that made strangers trust him inside of a minute. He crossed to his daughter with his arms already opening, and the temple exhaled a soft, approving murmur. Look how he loves her, even now, even like this. And he pressed a kiss to Hannah's temple, his hand closing warm and firm around her wrist. Hannah flinched. It was small, a fraction of a second, gone almost before it began, the kind of thing a room full of strangers watching a spectacle would never catch. Matthew caught it. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. His gaze dropped to where her father's fingers still circled her wrist, and something moved behind his composed expression. There and gone before anyone could put a name to it. He said nothing. He simply filed it away, the way a man files away a warning he intends to ask about later. And when Magnus finally released her and stepped back into the crowd's approval, Matthew's hand found the small of her back. Not for the audience, not for show, just steady, just there. The elder spoke the final binding words. Temple bells rang out over the northern territories, calling every wolf within 3 valleys to bear witness that the girl they called the Gatham Curse now belonged to Silvermoon. Hannah Darwin walked out of the Oldridge Temple on her husband's arm, wearing the small, practiced smile she had worn her whole life for rooms that only ever wanted a reason to keep laughing. She did not know, not yet, that the hardest part of the day was still hours away. That back at Silvermoon Keep, when the wedding gown finally came off, and the last of the candlelight fell across skin that had never once belonged only to her. Matthew Darwin was going to see exactly what her father's love had cost her, and nothing about their marriage would ever be a business arrangement again. Nothing about their marriage would ever be a business arrangement again. But 3 weeks earlier, when the offer first arrived by Raven, that was the only thing Matthew Darwin had wanted it to be. Silvermoon was dying by inches. The rogue packs had come through twice that spring, torching the wheat fields before anyone could raise a horn, and what the fire hadn't taken, a hard frost had finished off in a single night. Matthew had walked the burned rows himself the next morning, boots black to the ankle, and counted what was left. Not enough. Not for winter. Not for the pups. Not for the old wolves who'd already given the pack everything they had. 3 villages are down to bark bread, Caleb told him that night, laying the ledgers across the war table like evidence in a trial. His beta didn't soften anything, which was why Matthew trusted him. We owe the Iron Hollow traders more silver than we'll see in 2 years. If the Grand Council calls an audit before autumn, they'll strip your title and split the territory among packs who can actually feed their own. So we find another way. There isn't one. Caleb didn't look up from the ledgers, except the one sitting on your desk. The letter had arrived that morning, sealed with the Gatham crest. A full dowry, enough gold to rebuild 3 seasons of harvest, enough to clear every debt Silvermoon owed, in exchange for one thing. Alpha King Magnus Gatham had a daughter no one would marry, and he was prepared to pay handsomely for someone willing to take her off his hands. Matthew had heard what they called her. Everyone had. The Gatham Curse, the girl whose own wolf wouldn't claim her, the Omega 2 disfigured to be seen in daylight. He'd heard it the way you hear weather in a territory you've never visited. Distant, unverified, easy to repeat, and easier to believe. He hated that he was even considering it. He hated more that he didn't have the luxury not to. I want to meet her first, he told Magnus's steward, the day he finally rode to the Gatham stronghold. Before I agree to anything. It wasn't what alphas did in arrangements like this. Marriages between packs were sealed on paper, not on feeling. But Matthew had watched his father run Silvermoon on the principle that a wolf who wouldn't look you in the eye before making a promise wasn't a wolf worth trusting, and he wasn't about to break that rule for the first time over a woman he was about to marry. Hannah received him in a small stone study, standing rather than seated, her hands folded in front of her like she'd rehearsed exactly how to hold them. She didn't turn away the moment he saw her face, which surprised him more than it should have. She watched him watch her, waiting. He understood a beat too late, for the flinch, the pause, the polite excuse that would come next. "You can say it," she said, when he didn't. Her voice was steadier than he expected. "Whatever you were told to expect. I'd rather you say it now than pretend for a year." "I wasn't told to expect anything," Matthew said. "I was told your father would pay Silvermoon's debts if I married you. That's the only thing about this I actually know is true." Something shifted in her face. Not hope, not yet. Something more careful than that. "So you're here for the gold?" "I'm here because my pack is starving, and I ran out of better options 3 weeks ago." He didn't look away from her while he said it. because he'd decided somewhere on the ride over that he wasn't going to lie to her. Not even the small kind. Not even to make the next hour easier. I won't pretend this is a love match. I also won't pretend you're something I have to be brave about marrying. I don't know you yet. I'd like to. Hannah studied him the way a wolf studies unfamiliar ground, for the trap she assumed was there. Everyone who's stood where you're standing has found a reason to leave within the hour. I'm not leaving. You might, once you know all of it. Then tell me the parts that matter, and I'll decide for myself what I can carry. He said it plainly, no performance in it, and for the first time since he'd walked in, she didn't look ready to defend herself against him. They talked longer than either of them intended to. About Silvermoon, about the pups who wouldn't survive a hard winter without help, about a father she mentioned only once, and then steered carefully around, the way a person steers around a wound still too fresh to press on. By the time Matthew rode back through the gates, he had agreed to marry a woman he'd known for exactly 90 minutes, and he found, uneasily, that gold was no longer the only reason. What he didn't know, what Hannah didn't yet suspect either, was that Magnus watched the entire exchange from behind a shuttered window above the courtyard and smiled the way a man smiles when a plan has finally clicked into place. He hadn't offered his daughter's hand to save her from a lonely life. He had offered it because the Moonheart bloodline could only be unlocked through a lawful mate bond, and once Hannah's marriage activated whatever power her dead mother had hidden away, Magnus intended to make certain his daughter did not live long enough to claim it. The wedding, he had decided weeks ago, was never meant to last the year. The wedding feast lasted until well past moonrise, and Hannah sat through every toast, every long-winded blessing from elders who had never once looked her in the eye before today, in the same practiced smile she'd worn at the temple. Matthew sat beside her through all of it, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers whenever he leaned in to answer some Alpha's pointed question, and she noticed, she couldn't stop noticing, that he never once let the space between them read as distance to the room. By the time the carriage carried them up through Silvermoon's gates, she was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with dancing. You don't have to stay for any of it, Matthew said quietly, as they climbed the keep's stone steps. Whatever you need tonight. I meant that. She believed him. That frightened her more than she expected it to. In her chambers, she dismissed the attendants before they'd finished with the first pin in her hair. I can manage, she told them, and something in her voice must have carried enough weight that they didn't argue, only bowed and left her alone with the mirror and the long line of buttons down her back that she couldn't reach. She undid what she could. The rest she worked at with her fingers gone clumsy from champagne and nerves, until the gown finally loosened and slid, and she saw it in the mirror before she felt it. Thin lines of blood had bloomed through the white silk at her shoulders, where the fabric had pressed too long against skin that hadn't fully healed from 3 weeks ago. She was still standing there, one hand braced on the vanity, when Matthew knocked and, hearing nothing, opened the door. He stopped in the doorway. She watched him see it, the gown gaping at her back, the blood, and beneath it, before she could turn away or reach for a robe, everything else. The raised silver lines at her wrists where restraints had cut in over years, not months. The long marks across her shoulder blades that hadn't come from any accident. Symbols carved with deliberate, careful cruelty along her ribs, healed into scar tissue that would never fully fade. Blistered, silvery burns where wolfsbane leaves had been pressed into her skin. An Omega's wolf punished for staying silent. And beneath all of it, fresher than the rest, bruises still yellow-green from a hand that had gripped too hard, too recently. Hannah. His voice cracked on her name. Don't. She pulled the gown back up over her shoulder, hands shaking. Please don't look at me like that. Like what? Like I'm something that happened to me. Her voice broke in the middle of the sentence, and she hated it. Hated that after everything she'd survived, it was this. Being seen, actually seen, by someone who wasn't disgusted, that finally cracked her open. Everyone who's ever seen my face looks at me with pity or disgust. I know how to survive both of those. I don't know what to do with whatever this is. Matthew crossed the room slowly, the way you'd approach something wounded and cornered, and stopped an arm's length away, close enough to matter, far enough that she could still breathe. Can I touch your hand? He asked. Just your hand. You can say no. No one had ever asked her that. Not once. Not in 24 years. Not even the healers who were supposed to be helping her. Yes, she whispered. He took her hand like it was something that had been through a war and deserved to be treated like one. He didn't ask her to explain the scars. He didn't ask who. He already knew who, the way everyone in the Northern Territories quietly knew and had chosen, for years, to look away. I'm sorry, he said instead. Not for you. At you. That anyone let this happen to you for as long as they did. That was what broke her. Not the scars being seen, but someone finally being angry about them on her behalf instead of at her. She sat down hard on the edge of the bed and wept. The kind of crying that had nowhere polite to go, years of it, and Matthew didn't try to stop it or fix it. He simply sat beside her, close, but not touching, unless she reached for him first, and let her fall apart in a room where, for once, no one was going to punish her for it. It was a long while before she could speak again. There's something you need to know, she finally said, wiping her face, her voice raw but steadying. Something my father doesn't know I have. She rose, crossed to where her wedding gown lay discarded across the chair, and worked her fingers into a hidden seam along the bodice lining. A seam she had sewn herself, weeks ago, in secret. From inside it she drew out a small object wrapped in cloth, an ornate silver key, etched with markings that pulsed faintly, moonlight pale, the moment it touched open air. Matthew stared at it. What is that? My mother made certain I had it before she died, Hannah said. She told me never to let my father find it. She told me it would only work once I was truly, lawfully bound to someone. She looked up at him, key trembling slightly in her open palm. I think that someone is you, and I think we just activated something my father has been trying to get his hands on for 24 years. Matthew didn't reach for the key. He waited, the way he'd waited at the altar, letting her set the pace of everything that happened between them. Tell me, he said, all of it, however long it takes. Hannah wrapped the cloth back around the key, but kept it cupped in both hands, like something that might still be taken from her if she loosened her grip. My mother was Luna Celine, she began. Not just my father's mate. She carried something older than the Gathern line, the Moonheart bloodline, one of the last unbroken lines from the first wolves who ever walked under a full moon. It's not a title. It's power. Real power. Sealed away generations ago because it was too dangerous to leave unguarded. Sealed where? A vault. Hidden somewhere on Gathern land, though I've never seen it. Only heard my mother mention it once, when I was young enough that I thought it was a bedtime story. Hannah's fingers tightened around the key. She told me the vault could only be opened by a Moonheart heir who had entered a true, lawful mate bond. Not a political marriage. A real one, recognized by the moon itself. She said the marriage would activate the inheritance the moment it was sealed. Which is tonight. Which is tonight. She met his eyes. I don't fully understand what that means yet. But I know my father has spent my entire life trying to get to whatever's inside that vault. And he's never been able to. Because he was never the heir. I am. Matthew sat back slowly, pieces sliding into place with the sick clarity of a man realizing he'd walked into something far larger than a debt repayment. Hannah, what happened to your mother? For a long moment she didn't answer. When she did, her voice had gone flat. The careful flatness of someone reciting a fact so old it had stopped being able to hurt her freshly. The official story is that she died of a wasting sickness, 6 months after I was born. The truth is that my father killed her. Once he learned what she carried and understood he'd never be able to touch it himself. He needed a Moonheart heir who trusted him. He couldn't have a mate who saw exactly what he was. And the vault, empty to him, sealed to anyone who isn't blood, and useless without a lawful bond besides. She looked down at the key still wrapped in her palms. So he raised me instead. And when my wolf never surfaced, because Moonheart wolves sleep until they're ready, my mother told me, not because anything is wrong. He decided I was broken. He brought in Healer Varys, called it treatment, told the pack I was fragile, that I needed careful handling, and no one ever asked what careful handling meant behind closed doors, because my father is very good at being loved in public. Matthew's jaw had gone tight in a way she was starting to recognize, not disgust, never that, but something colder and more focused, aimed entirely away from her. He tortured his own daughter trying to force a bloodline awake. For 24 years. She said it simply, because saying it any other way would have required more of her than she had left tonight. He also emptied the Moonheart treasury, generations of my family swore to protect, funneled it into the war debts he's used to buy influence across 3 territories. If the Grand Council ever found proof, he'd lose everything. His title, his seat, possibly his life. She finally looked up. That's what this key means, Matthew. Proof, if we can find the vault, and a target on both our backs, the moment he realizes his marriage gift just handed his daughter exactly what he spent 2 decades trying to take from her. Matthew reached out. Slowly, the way he'd learned tonight was the only way that mattered, and closed his hand gently around both of hers, key and all. Then we find the vault, together, and whatever's inside it, we use it to end what he's been doing to you. For the first time since the temple, Hannah let herself lean, just slightly, into someone else's steadiness. That was when the window shattered. A raven crashed through the glass in a spray of feathers and cold night air, dropping a scroll sealed with the Gathrum crest, before wheeling back out into the dark. Matthew was on his feet instantly. Key discarded on the bed. Hannah pulled behind him before either of them had fully processed the sound. He broke the seal with shaking hands and read it once, twice, his face going still in the particular way she now understood meant something in him had gone cold with fury. He turned the scroll toward her without a word. 3 lines, in her father's precise hand, meant for eyes that were never supposed to include hers. The bond is sealed. She has what she needs to destroy me. Kill them both before sunrise. Make it look like rogues. Before either of them could speak, the horn sounded from the eastern wall. 1 long note, then 3 short ones. The pattern every wolf in Silvermoon had been trained since pupdom to recognize. Attack. Matthew's hand closed hard around hers. Stay behind me. Whatever happens next, stay behind me. Outside, in the dark beyond the keep's torchlight, the first assassins were already scaling the outer wall. The first assassin came through the balcony doors, before Matthew had even finished turning Hannah toward the inner hallway. He was fast, faster than any hired blade had a right to be. But Matthew was faster still, shifting mid-stride into the massive silver-gray wolf that had earned Silvermoon's respect long before its alpha had earned anything else. He met the intruder in the air, jaws closing hard around a forearm meant to carry a blade toward Hannah's back, and the man went down before he ever got close enough to matter. Go! Matthew snarled, shifted back just long enough to force the word out. The east corridor, now. There are 2 more behind you. Hannah's voice cut through the chaos, oddly certain, oddly calm. Matthew turned. There was no one behind him. Not yet. But even as he opened his mouth to tell her so, the tapestry along the east wall shivered, and 2 more shapes dropped down from the rafters, exactly where she'd said they would be. He didn't have time to ask how she'd known. He barely had time to meet them. Hannah flattened herself against the stone as the fight tore through the room, and something strange moved beneath her skin while she watched it. Not fear exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but a low, restless pull she'd never felt before, like a limb waking up after years asleep. She could feel where the danger was before she saw it. She'd felt the 2 men in the rafters a full 3 seconds before they dropped. She didn't understand what it meant, only that for the first time in 24 years, something inside her that had always been silent was starting, faintly, to listen. Not dead. Her mother's voice, unbidden, rising up from some cornered part of her memory, just sleeping. A 3rd assassin came through the door behind her, blade already raised, and Hannah didn't think. She moved, twisting hard enough to send a heavy iron candlestick swinging into his temple with a force that surprised her more than it surprised him. He went down hard. She stood over him, breathing ragged, hands shaking with something that wasn't only adrenaline. Matthew was there a heartbeat later, shifted back to human. Blood, not his own, she registered distantly, striped across one shoulder. He took in the fallen man, then her, then the candlestick still gripped white-knuckled in her hand, and something crossed his face that looked almost like awe. Are you hurt? His hands went to her face, careful, checking. No, I don't know how I knew where they were. Her voice cracked on it. I've never known anything like that before. We'll figure it out. Later. He turned, scanning the wreckage of the room, and his expression hardened again into something colder. Right now I need one of them alive. Caleb dragged the last conscious assassin in a few minutes later, wrists bound, the fighting elsewhere in the keep dying down into the low, uneasy quiet that follows a battle nobody was fully prepared for. Silvermoon had held, barely. 2 of the pack's sentries were down and wouldn't be getting back up, and the cost of tonight would take days to fully count. But the keep still stood, and so did they. Matthew crouched in front of the bound man, voice low and level, in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. Who sent you? The assassin said nothing. You already know I have the letter. Matthew held up the scroll, Magnus's crest catching torchlight. I have his handwriting. I have his order. All I need from you is confirmation, and then I decide whether you're useful to me alive. The man's laugh came out wet and broken, blood at the corner of his mouth from a wound Hannah hadn't noticed until now. One of the sentry's final blows, deeper than anyone had realized in the chaos. He was dying, she understood suddenly, slowly, and he knew it. Doesn't matter what you decide, he rasped, eyes sliding past Matthew to Hannah, something almost like pity in them. Doesn't matter what happens tonight. Kill me, keep me, doesn't change a thing. Why not? Matthew said. The assassin's gaze stayed fixed on Hannah as the light in it began, unmistakably, to fade. Because the Alpha King already owns your pack. He was gone before Matthew could ask him what that meant, before either of them could ask anything at all, and the words hung in the wrecked, blood-streaked room like a second attack, worse than the first, because this one had no blade Matthew could put himself between. Hannah felt the strange new pull inside her go suddenly, sharply cold. Somewhere inside Silvermoon's walls, someone they trusted already belonged to her father. The weeks after the attack settled into something Hannah had never had a name for before, an ordinary life. It started with breakfast. Matthew had never once, in 3 weeks of shared mornings, commented on her face. Not a kind word meant to reassure her, not an averted glance meant to spare himself. He simply passed her the bread, asked what she thought of the Eastern grain reports, and let her be a person at the table instead of a spectacle. It was such a small thing. It undid her a little more each morning. The chair was the first thing she noticed changing without being asked. The heavy carved one at the head of the estate table had always dug into her hips after an hour of sitting. She'd never said anything, had learned long ago that comfort wasn't a thing she was owed an opinion on. But a week into their marriage it was simply gone, replaced with a wider, cushioned seat that fit her the way the old one never had. She asked Mira about it. Mira only smiled and said the Alpha had mentioned the old one looked uncomfortable, and had it swapped out himself, quietly, without a word to anyone. He does that, Mira said. Notices things, doesn't make a show of fixing them. Mira had become something Hannah hadn't expected to find at Silvermoon, a friend who asked nothing of her except honesty. She braided Hannah's hair some mornings not because it was her duty but because she liked to, chattered about kitchen gossip and Caleb's terrible attempts at flirting, and never once flinched at the scars Hannah no longer bothered hiding around her. The ledgers were where Hannah found her footing fastest. Matthew brought her into the estate meetings out of necessity at first. Silvermoon's finances were still a wound barely scabbed over. But by the second week he'd stopped explaining things to her and started asking her opinion instead. She found the error in the grain tax accounting that had been bleeding the treasury dry for 2 seasons. She restructured 3 trade agreements that had Caleb staring at her like she'd performed actual magic instead of arithmetic. "Where did you learn to do this?" Matthew asked, watching her rework a column of numbers that had defeated his steward for a month. "My father kept me locked in rooms a great deal," Hannah said, not looking up. "Books were the only company that never looked at me strangely. I read everything in his library. Eventually, including the ledgers he thought I was too broken to understand." Matthew didn't say anything to that, but she saw, out of the corner of her eye, the muscle working in his jaw, the same look he'd worn the night he'd found the scars, quiet and furious on her behalf. The dancing lesson happened by accident. One evening when Mira insisted Hannah at least learn the steps for the harvest gathering, and Matthew, passing through the hall, got roped into partnering when Caleb proved hopeless. He was careful with her at first, holding her the way you'd hold something you were afraid to break, until she stepped on his foot hard enough to make him yelp, and the whole careful formality of it collapsed into real laughter. The kind that startled her because she couldn't remember the last time it had happened without an audience she needed to perform for. "You're doing that on purpose," he accused, grinning, not letting go of her hand. "Absolutely not," she said, and stepped on his foot again. He was falling for her. He recognized it somewhere around the third week, in a quiet, unguarded moment watching her argue passionately with Caleb about interest rates, hair coming loose from its pins, utterly unself-conscious in a way she'd never been in front of anyone else at Silvermoon. He hadn't married her for this. He found, increasingly, that he no longer cared what he'd married her for at all. Not everyone at Silvermoon shared the household's growing warmth. In the shadowed corner of the kitchens, in the quiet hour after the staff had gone to bed, a hand slipped a folded note beneath a loose stone near the stable wall, the same drop point that had been in use for weeks now, feeding careful, small details back toward Gatham land. "She grows stronger. She trusts the household. Recommend a quieter method than steal." Hannah noticed nothing. There was too much good, suddenly, filling up the space where dread used to live. It was Mira who brought the afternoon tea up 3 days later. The same routine they'd shared a dozen times. A pot from the kitchens, 2 cups, gossip about the harvest gathering. Hannah was mid-sentence, laughing at something Mira had said about Caleb, when Mira reached for her own cup first, the way she always did, taking a sip before setting Hannah's down in front of her. She didn't finish the sentence she'd been in the middle of. The cup slipped from her hand and shattered against the stone floor, and Mira went down after it, choking, her whole body seizing before Hannah had even registered what she was seeing. "Mira!" Hannah was on her knees beside her before she'd finished screaming for help, hands shaking, no idea yet that the poison in that cup had never been meant for the maid at all. Mira lived, though it took 3 days, and every skill sagely unpossessed to be certain of it. She woke on the 4th morning weak and hollow-eyed, and the first thing she did was apologize for dropping the good teapot. Hannah cried harder over that than she had over almost anything else that year. The poisoning changed something in the household. A wariness under the warmth now, doors checked twice, food tasted before it reached the table. But it also sharpened Hannah's resolve. Whatever her father was willing to do to stop her, the answer wasn't to wait quietly for the next attempt. The answer was in the vault. "My mother mentioned a sanctuary," Hannah said, turning the key over in her hands, as she and Matthew pored over old Gatham land surveys by lamplight. Not the vault itself, a place that held it, somewhere on the border, forgotten enough that no one thought to guard it, because no one remembered what it was guarding. They found it 2 days later, past the tree line where Gatham land met Silvermoon's, a ring of standing stones half swallowed by ivy, easy to mistake for ruins with no purpose left. At its center stood a single door-shaped slab of black stone, seamless, without hinge or handle. The key fit the moment Hannah pressed it to the stone's surface, its moonlight-pale markings flaring brighter than she'd ever seen them. The slab groaned inward, revealing a narrow stair descending into dark. The chamber below took her breath. Shelves lined every wall, packed with scrolls and sealed jars and objects she had no name for. A circlet of Oldridge that hummed faintly when she passed it, weapons forged in patterns no living smith would recognize. And at the center, on a stone pedestal, a stack of leather journals bound in twine, her mother's handwriting unmistakable on the topmost cover. Hannah's hands shook as she opened it. Entry after entry, in Luna Celine's careful hand, chronicling years of quiet fear, suspicions about her mate's ambitions, notes about the treasury figures that never quite added up, and near the end, in a hand less steady than the rest, "He knows what I carry. I no longer believe he will let me live to pass it on. If I am gone and this is found, know that I loved my daughter more than I feared him, and that was never enough to save either of us." Matthew had gone very quiet beside her, working through a separate stack of records, bloodline documents, treasury ledgers with Magnus's seal, and finally, a single water-stained letter that made him go rigid where he stood. "Matthew?" He didn't answer at first. When he finally spoke, his voice had a rawness in it she'd never heard from him. "My father didn't die in a rogue attack." He turned the letter toward her. Payment records, a mercenary's name, a date that matched exactly the night Silvermoon's previous alpha had been killed clearing a border dispute. Your father paid for it, years before either of us ever met. He weakened Silvermoon on purpose, so that whoever inherited would be desperate enough to accept exactly the offer he made me. Something in him broke loose then, not at her, but around her, a wave of grief and fury he couldn't fully leash. He turned and struck the stone wall hard enough to crack it, breathing like a man trying not to shift out of sheer rage, and for one unguarded moment, Hannah saw the wolf just beneath his skin, teeth bared at a decade-old wound finally given a name. Matthew. She kept her voice level, didn't flinch back from him the way instinct told her to. Look at me. He took my father to get to a pack he could exploit. He took your mother to get to a bloodline he couldn't touch. He took years from you, and you're still here, still choosing not to become the kind of man who takes it out on the people around him. She stepped closer, put her hand flat against his chest, over the frantic beat of his heart. That's the difference between you and him. Don't lose it in this room. He exhaled, long and shaking, and some of the wildness went out of his shoulders. I'm sorry, he said. Not at you. Never at you. I know. She meant it. We use this. All of it. That's how we make it mean something instead of just hurting. He pressed his forehead to hers, something wordless passing between them that felt larger than either grief or gold. Closer, she thought, to whatever this was actually turning into. They were still gathering what they could carry, when the ground above them shuddered, and smoke began threading down through the stairwell. By the time they broke back out into the night air, the standing stones were already burning, torches thrown by riders already vanishing back toward Gathermland, the ancient sanctuary consumed in flame faster than anything natural should burn. Magnus had found out, and he intended to make certain nothing else was left for them to find. The journals. Matthew turned back toward the stairwell before Hannah could stop him, arms already full of what they'd salvaged. There's still more down there. The relics. The bloodline records. Matthew! It's collapsing! He was already moving, taking the stairs 2 at a time back down into smoke, and Hannah's scream after him was lost in the roar as the stone ceiling gave way behind him, sealing the entrance in a wall of burning debris. She didn't think. She didn't decide. Something older than thought moved through her, and she was at the collapsed entrance clawing at burning stone before her mind caught up to her hands, heat scorching her palms, smoke tearing her lungs, and still she didn't stop, because the alternative was a world with Matthew on the wrong side of that wall. Not dead, her mother's voice again, rising up from somewhere ancient and patient inside her. Just sleeping. Wake up now. The pull she'd felt the night of the attack surged up through her all at once, no longer a whisper but a roar, and the change took her the way a held breath finally releases. Not painful, not violent, but inevitable, decades overdue. Where an exhausted Omega woman had been kneeling in the ash a heartbeat before, a wolf rose instead, vast and silver-white, moonlight seeming to pour off her fur rather than simply catch it, eyes burning gold in the dark. Not an Omega's wolf, not anything the Northern Territories had a name for anymore, not in 4 generations. The lunar guardian tore through burning stone like it was rotted wood. She found Matthew collapsed near the pedestal, a beam pinned across his leg, smoke thick enough that he'd stopped fighting it, and in her wolf form she closed her jaws with impossible gentleness around the fabric at his shoulder and dragged him clear, out through the ruin of the stairwell, out into open air, moments before the last of the chamber gave way behind them in a final, thunderous collapse. She shifted back the instant they were clear, coughing, hands and knees in the dirt, and Matthew was already crawling toward her, leg dragging, both of them scorched and smoke-blackened and alive. You shifted, he said, staring at her like he was seeing her for the first time, in every sense that mattered. Hannah, you shifted. I don't know what I am now. Her voice shook, half terror, half something closer to wonder. I do. He reached for her face, careful the way he'd been careful with her from the very first night, thumb brushing ash from her cheek. You're extraordinary. You've always been extraordinary. It just took the rest of the world too long to see it. Behind them, what remained of the sanctuary burned itself down to embers. The sky over the border stones lit orange against the dark. Neither of them looked back at it. I need to tell you something, Matthew said. "And I need you to actually hear it. Not just let me say it and move past it." "Okay. I came here to save my pack." His hand hadn't left her face. That was the whole of it, in the beginning. Gold, harvests, debts I couldn't see any other way out of. I told myself that was all this would ever be, because it was easier than admitting how fast that stopped being true. His voice roughened. "Now I'd lose every kingdom before I'd lose you. I mean that. Not as a kindness, not because you saved my life tonight, though you did. Because somewhere between the temple and this fire, you became the only thing about any of this I actually can't live without." Hannah had spent 24 years learning exactly how disgust looked on someone's face, cataloging it so thoroughly she could recognize it in a heartbeat from across a crowded room. She had never once had to learn what the opposite looked like. She was looking at it now, and it undid every careful defense she'd built to survive a lifetime of the other thing. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to let someone actually want me and not brace for the moment it turns out to be a mistake. Then we'll learn how together. Slowly, however long it takes." He leaned in, giving her every chance to pull back, the way he'd given her that chance from the very first night. "Can I kiss you?" "Yes," she breathed, and this time there was no hesitation in it at all. The kiss was gentle first, careful, and then something more when neither of them pulled away. Smoke and ash and moonlight and 24 years of a heart that had never once been asked what it wanted, finally, quietly, being asked. They rode back to Silvermoon before dawn, her wolf's existence still a secret only the two of them carried, evidence of Magnus's crimes reduced to what little they'd managed to save from the fire. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to be dangerous, and Magnus clearly believed the same. Word reached them within the week. Alpha King Magnus Gatherm had called an emergency session of the Grand Alpha Council. All territories, all bloodlines, summoned to Gatherm land within the month. Officially, the summons cited concerns about his daughter's mental stability and a marriage arranged under false pretenses. Unofficially, Hannah understood exactly what it was. Her father intended to destroy her credibility before she ever got the chance to destroy him. The Grand Council chamber had never held every territory at once before. Iron Hollow, Redcliffe, Thornwood, a dozen packs Hannah had only ever read about in her father's ledgers, all crowded beneath the vaulted stone to watch the Alpha King's daughter answer for her supposed madness. Magnus stood first, composed, grieving, magnificent, in his performance of a father worried sick. "My daughter suffered a breakdown after her wedding," he told the assembled alphas. "Delusions, paranoid accusations against her own blood. I ask the council's mercy for her, and an annulment for the sake of both packs." "I'd like to present evidence before mercy is discussed," Hannah said, rising. She did not raise her voice. She had learned, 24 years too well, that a room only respected volume from people it had already decided to believe, so she gave them precision instead. Luna Celine's journals, entry after entry documenting fear that predated any wedding by decades. Healer Varys's own treatment records, dates and methods listed in his own careful hand. Treasury ledgers showing gold vanishing from the Moonheart accounts into war debts that had bought Magnus influence across 3 territories. The letter proving her mother's death had not been sickness. The payment records proving Silvermoon's previous alpha had not died to rogues. "And this," Matthew added, stepping forward, "the dying words of the assassin sent to kill us both, witnessed by myself and my beta." He repeated them plainly. "The Alpha King already owns your pack. We've since confirmed a household spy, working for Magnus Gatherm, feeding him information for months." Magnus laughed, thin and practiced. "Fabrications! Desperate fabrications from a girl who— Enough!" Every head turned. Healer Varys had risen from his seat near the back, an old man suddenly looking every one of his years, hands trembling. "I kept records because I knew, someday, someone would ask for the truth, and I intended to still be alive to tell it." His voice shook but didn't waver. "Everything the Lady Hannah has shown you is real. I administered those treatments on Alpha King Gatherm's direct order, for over a decade, and I have spent every year since telling myself I had no choice. I did have a choice. I am done pretending otherwise." The chamber erupted. Magnus, cornered in a way 20 years of political grace had never prepared him for, made his final mistake. He turned on Varys with a fury too raw to be anything but genuine, snarling that the old healer would pay for his betrayal exactly the way Selene had, and the room went utterly silent around the words no one present could unhear. He had confessed. In front of the entire Grand Council, he had confessed. The verdict took less than an hour. Magnus Gathern was stripped of his title, his lands, his seat on the council he had once dominated, and led out in chains to a cell he would not leave again. What followed unfolded faster than Hannah had let herself hope for. Silvermoon's debts were cleared from the recovered Moonheart treasury. The bloodline passed formally into her name, and where the inheritance settled into her, the land itself seemed to exhale, burned fields greening again within weeks, a hard winter turning gentle, as if the territory had simply been waiting for someone to finally claim it with love instead of ambition. That evening, alone in their chambers, Matthew took her hands in his, quieter than she'd seen him in months. "You're free now," he said. "No debts. No father holding anything over either of us. If you want an annulment, if any part of this still feels like something you were forced into, I'll sign whatever you need me to sign, and I won't make it harder than it has to be." Hannah looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had offered her his arm before anyone told him to, who had asked permission before touching her wrist, who had chosen her 100 small times before he'd ever had a single reason to. "I choose you," she said, "not because I have to, because I want to. That's the whole answer." 1 year later, Silvermoon Keep overflowed with something it hadn't held in a generation: abundance, and laughter that didn't need an excuse. Hannah had turned the eastern wing into a sanctuary for Omegas and pups who'd survived what she had survived, run personally alongside Mira, who never once let her forget how far they'd both come. She wore no veil anymore, in any weather, for any occasion. The birthmark that had once earned her a lifetime of cruel names now simply belonged to her, undisguised, unapologized for. Their son was born that spring, and on the night of his first full moon, his wolf rose silver pale and unmistakable, the Moonheart bloodline, awake and unbroken, carried forward at last. Before a gathering of every pack in the Northern Territories, Matthew took Hannah's hand, not to protect her, not to shield her from a room that had once laughed at her, but simply because it was where he wanted to stand. The wolves who had once mocked the ugliest daughter of the Alpha King bowed instead to their Luna, whose strength had never come from her face, but from every unbroken thing she'd carried beneath it. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.